Hello, everyone. Welcome. As you're coming in, if you could let us know um, where you're tuning in from and, um, and what brought you here this evening. And we'll wait for people to come in. We're about halfway there. So yeah, let us know where you're tuning in from. What brought you here? Looks like we have someone from Potomac. Someone from West Hartford. Ludlow, Vermont, Cantonsville, Maryland. All right, so you know what? We'll just go ahead and get started, Minneapolis. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host tonight's program, Christmas Past, the fascinating stories behind our favorite holidays traditions. Now, the Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and our other virtual programs. Now, let's move on to introducing tonight's program. We are welcoming Brian Earl for a discussion with Mallory Howard about his book, Christmas Past. In this book, Brian explores the stories behind Christmas traditions and provides a lens through which readers can view Christmas as festive, cheerful, strange, and above all, endlessly fascinating. So our author, Brian Earl, is a designer, writer, and podcaster. He has performed a version of the podcast as a live show in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. That podcast is Christmas Past. He was a speaker at Christmas Con, a Christmas movie fan conference in 2019, and also at Podcasts Movement, the podcasting industry's largest conference in 2018. He is a frequent guest on many popular Christmas-themed podcasts and other podcasts. And our moderator, Mallory Howard, is the Assistant Curator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. She's held the position since 2015. Before that, she worked as a curatorial assistant and historical interpreter. Overall, she's been at our museum for 15 years. So we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat during our program this evening. If you have any specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please feel free to ask it at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. If you've already read the book, go ahead and ask a question or ask your question as soon as it strikes you. Please also know that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. So that is it from me. Please sit back and enjoy. And I'll turn this over to Brian and Mallory.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Omar. And I just want to thank you, Brian, for joining us tonight to chat about your book, which I have right here. Highly recommend. It was a fantastic read. So I'm very excited to dig in with you about this a little bit. So first of all, right off the bat, I was hoping you would tell me a little bit about how and why Christmas became such an important part of your life.
Well, it was right from birth. I grew up in Stoughton, Massachusetts with a mom who was really, really heavily into Christmas. And I would say, I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was a particular feel to Christmases back then. This was the era of Teddy Ruxpin and Rubik's Cube and all of that set against a backdrop of New England, where it still used to snow during Christmas time in those days, although things have changed now. And yeah, I was one of 5 children. I grew up on a cul-de-sac with a bunch of kids on it. I had a bunch of cousins and aunts and uncles who all lived within driving distance. So Christmas had this very homey feel to it. And again, like that 70s and 80s style Christmas. I feel like probably everyone says that the Christmases that they grew up with were special in some way, but I really do feel like the 80s in particular produced maybe twice their fair share of popular culture. It's stuff that we still look back on today with a kind of fondness. And my mom in particular was a very handcrafty kind of person. She made our Christmas stockings. I still have that stocking to this very day. She made it at her sewing table. All of our decorations seem to be handmade. We had this homemade advent calendar, of which she made an exact replica for me last year so that I could carry on the tradition with my baby son. So it was really just something that was imbued in me from the very, very start.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I was about to say, I remember growing up in the 90s, I felt like Christmas was so special and nostalgic. So it makes sense that it was that way for you too. And you now, besides writing this book, you also have a podcast.
Yeah.
Now, why did you decide to enter that realm and sort of do a Christmas podcast?
Well, it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to make a Christmas podcast. I wanted to listen to a Christmas podcast. And this was September of 2015. I remember it clearly. Even for someone like me who loves Christmas, I start to get into the spirit a little bit early, but I don't want too much of a good thing too quickly. So I don't put up all the decorations in September or October, but I might start, reading a Christmas novel or listen to a podcast. And back then, and still now to some extent, most of the podcasts I listened to were like the Planet Money or Radio Lab or Freakonomics style, like NPR, nerdy, deep divey kind of podcasts. And I said, oh, I wonder if that exists for Christmas. I wonder if there's like Freakonomics for Christmas. And so I went looking for it and of course, didn't find it. And at the time in 2015, there were maybe a dozen Christmas podcasts. There was one that was put out by a DJ in LA called The Christmas Talking. I still think it's one of the best podcasts about Christmas that ever was, even though it doesn't put out episodes anymore. And then it would be like a church put out their Christmas sermons in the form of a podcast. And there are some playlists of like Celtic Christmas music. But long story short, nothing that met what I was looking for. And so I said, well, I can't be the only person who'd be interested in something like this. Maybe I'll try to create it myself. And I feel like that's very different, at least nowadays, from a lot of other people's journey into podcasting, where they're very much like, well, everyone else has a podcast, so what should mine be about? Or I need one of these to promote my business, or hey, this sounds like fun. I went looking for something, and when it didn't exist, I figured I would try to offer it up to the world. Now, the only problem with this is that I had absolutely no business trying anything like that because I don't present myself as any kind of subject matter expert. I'm not an academic or an historian or anything like that. And if I were going to match that NPR style, it's worth pointing out I'm not any kind of journalist. I mean, I'm a software designer, but I knew what I wanted to create. I knew exactly what I wanted people to feel when they listened to it. And that's really what I say I bring to the table, where, I'm not a subject matter expert, but I find the subject matter experts. I try to find the most highly qualified person I can on a given topic. I read their work, I interview them, and then I shape it into a very specific and highly stylized listening experience. And so I think I'm using my knack for storytelling and content production to create something that, at least, for the last 7 seasons, there's nothing else quite like it in the Christmas podcast realm.
That's amazing. And I've listened to some episodes and I really, really enjoy it. So I highly recommend, besides his book, checking out the podcast as well. But one of the big questions I have to sort of kick us off is maybe some of the negative aspects of Christmas. I know you mentioned this in your book, but people do talk about how Christmas has become maybe too commercialized. Now we have online shopping, so you don't have as many people going out to the malls anymore. They're doing a lot of it online. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's changed?
Yeah, well, people love to say Christmas is becoming too commercial. And my response to that would be, it would be more surprising if it weren't more. I mean, Christmas is a reflection of us. As we become an increasingly secular society, Christmas becomes an increasingly secular celebration. As we do more of our shopping online, we do more of our Christmas shopping online. As we, become more industrial, or I think that ship has sailed, but at the point in which we sort of transition from more of a agricultural society to a more industrial society, we saw all of that reflected in Christmas. And I think one of the interesting things about this, and Stephen Nissenbaum talks about this in his wonderful book, The Battle for Christmas, is that, yeah, Christmas is a reflection of who we are, but also because it is such a significant cultural force, it's also one of those things that's influencing what we are. It's both a cause and an effect. You think about how Christmas really, really has the power to change the way that we live our lives for like almost 6 weeks out of the year. We change the way we dress when we put on those ugly sweaters. We change our schedules. We change a lot of our attitudes and priorities. We even change the way we talk. I mean, because when you think about it, when else do you use the word merry? I mean, unless it's to say, you know, Merry Christmas to someone, or if you're describing a merry-go-round, I suppose. There's a lot about Christmas that exists like language. It kind of like haunts the season, like a little ghost. It's something we trot out for 6 weeks out of the year and then put back away. So a lot of the criticisms we get about Christmas are really just criticisms of us. I mean, of course, Christmas is becoming more commercial. Of course, it's becoming a lot more, I don't know what the word, maybe sterilized, and a lot more unified. You know, I talk about this many points during the book, but, you know, prior to, say, the mid-19th century, there really was no one understanding of Christmas. You had a lot of different communities that celebrated it in their own way. That's still true today for some extent, but then along comes the mass media, where you could present one image of Santa Claus, one image of Christmas celebrations far and wide, and then all of a sudden now everyone has the same idea about them. I feel like we're going through another period of that now with social media, where things are becoming even more converged. Like if you go on your social media feed and try to get a sense of what Facebook thinks Christmas is, and it's going to be the same, GIF of Will Ferrell running through the revolving doors and Elf, lots of memes about certain Christmas movies and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just yet another example of how different forms of media influence how we think about Christmas, which then influences how we celebrate Christmas. And it's a part of this never-ending thing. And a big thing that comes up on the podcast and in the book is that Christmas is always changing, which in a way feels ironic because it's based on this 2,000-year-old religious story. It's filled with all kinds of ancient tradition. And yet, at the same time, it's fluid and malleable. We decide what it is. And every year that we as a culture celebrate it, we're writing the next chapter in this never-ending story.
Yeah, that's a great point that, we're the ones that are changing and evolving, not necessarily. Yeah, that's wonderful. Very interesting. And this kind of to piggyback on that a little bit, and you mentioned this, you touched upon it, is some people get really worked up about when Christmas gets put out. Do you have a particular opinion on when Christmas is there a certain time that's too early? And then I loved in your book, you kind of talked a little bit about some people want it to be a burr holiday. And can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so let me see. I'll start with my personal preference. I used to put up my Christmas tree on Halloween. And I know that makes me unusual, but I'm okay with that. I'm not allowed to do that anymore because my son's birthday is on November 7th, and we can't do anything Christmassy before then. So then the next natural date was Veterans Day, which happened to be November 11th this year. So that's when I put up my Christmas tree. For a lot of people, Thanksgiving seems to be the cutoff point. Anything before Thanksgiving is too early, and then anything after that is just about right. And I'm always quick to point out that that too is a very new and highly contrived concept that was really from the beginning of the 20th century. And the people behind that were like the Woolworths and the Macy's. Macy's did their first Thanksgiving Day parade, I think in 1923, I want to say. And they were even pretty overt about it. They wanted to extend the shopping season. The Christmas season was to be between 4 and 5 weeks leading up to Christmas. Now, even before all of that came along, the length of the season was always really malleable and pretty subjective. I mean, you guys have heard of the 12 days of Christmas. Well, what does that refer to? That is the festivities. The Christmas season long ago used to begin on Christmas Day and last for 12 days up to the eve of the Epiphany on January 6th, and those were the 12 days of Christmas. The season leading up to it, the one that we're in now, was Advent season, and it still is if you're religious, but it was not this celebratory period. It was much more about fasting and restraint and prayer and all of that. So you're right that for a long, long time, and about 100 years now, the Christmas season has been recognized as that month leading up to Christmas. Whereas before that, it might have been like the week leading up to Christmas. And now, Hallmark is putting out their countdown to Christmas starting before Halloween. You start seeing those blow-up decorations in Home Depot in August. So there's a lot of market forces at work here trying to tell us when it's appropriate to start thinking about Christmas. But I feel like that's kind of always been true ever since Christmas became more of a commercial holiday. And you're right, in the Philippines, there's this notion of the Ber months, BER, meaning all the months ending in BER, so September through December, as a kind of extended festive season. And I think for people like me, you put that together with the advent of social media where we can find validation and reinforcement. I think you're starting to see a bit more of that. And again, back to this idea that Christmas is always evolving. If it was once true that the Christmas season was the week leading up to Christmas, now it's the month, is it inconceivable that sometime soon it's going to be the 6 weeks or the 8 weeks leading up to Christmas? I don't think so. I think there are always going to be the resistors, but I think we're heading in that direction. I think it'll be within our lifetimes.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see when people decide they're ready to enter that festive Christmas season. And I don't think there's any particular right or wrong answer, based on an individual when they want to begin. So now shifting gears a little bit, I love the history that you talk about with these various traditions. And there were a lot of things that surprised me reading the book, but you also mention how Christmas in the United States is really made up of a bunch of different traditions, sort of the melting pot from across the globe. Can you talk about one or two of, your favorite ones or really interesting ones that have been brought over from other places?
Well, the big one would be the Christmas tree. And that wasn't really brought over, well, it was in a way, but it was more brought into the British royal family through Germany. So it was Charlotte, Mary George III, brought the Christmas tree into British royal family around that time. It didn't really catch on because the royal family wasn't super popular. But then along came Queen Victoria, who was super popular, and a very famous image of her celebrating with Prince Albert, who also brought the Christmas tree over because he was German too. And then the Christmas tree became the must-have accessory. The following year over in America, Franklin Pierce was president and he had the first national Christmas tree. So this was one of those, traditions where, like many others, there are many other regional traditions that still exist today in other parts of the country, like in other parts of the world. Like in Norway, they go to a sauna on Christmas Eve. In Italy, they have La Befana. There's all kinds of things that just never made it over here to America. And for everyone that did, it could have very easily become like one of those other ones that just never caught on. It's all a matter of being in the right place at the right time. So the Christmas tree would be one. I hesitate to say Santa Claus because that really is mostly an American invention. And then one of the things I've been talking about on the podcast this year is because so much of our celebration here in America is heavily based on the British Christmas. We take influences from other places, but we take most of our influence from Victorian England. It's interesting that we didn't really adopt all of it. Like the figgy pudding, for example. I mean, sure, some people make one here, but it's not at all super common. Fruitcake used to be really popular here, and that's mostly a Victorian thing. Fruitcake had been around for a long, long time, but they kind of put the finishing touches on it. The version of fruitcake that you think of when you think of Christmas is mostly a Victorian invention. And it was popular here for a while, then kind of faded out. Christmas crackers, I don't know if anyone is familiar with those. You kind of pull them apart and they have a little thing inside. I've never understood why those were not popular in America. You think that something that goes bang and that there's like fun stuff inside. It's really hard for me to understand why something like that wouldn't have caught on here, but I guess it didn't. I'm trying to think of other immigrant traditions that caught on here where there's like a super interesting story. I'm sorry, I'm kind of drawing a blank on that.
No, I think that's fascinating. And it makes sense to have all these cultures coming to the United States and sort of sharing these traditions that they've had and us latching on to some and maybe not others. So, and another thing that surprised me was you mentioned that New York City is considered one of the epicenters of Christmas in the United States. Why is that? It makes sense when I think about it, but can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Well, yeah, so this was around, let's say, the middle of the 19th century. You had a big wave of immigration from Europe. You had a concentration of a melding of immigrant cultures in one small area. This is also coinciding with a time where we're moving from mostly an agricultural society to an industrial one. So you think like before the Civil War, I think it was something like 1 out of every 3 Americans was a farmer, and then all that really quickly started to change. You're also seeing the building of New York City. It's starting toward the middle of the 19th century, more toward the beginning of the 20th, where things are really starting to flesh out. But, big retailers like Woolworths and Macy's, and then, throughout the Northeast, you have Wanamaker's in Philadelphia, things like that too. a changing economy, which can really, help to create that feedback loop of Christmas becoming a more commercial holiday and more people in what we would now recognize as the middle class becoming more consumers. But New York in particular also had some of the first Christmas tree displays. I want to say it was 1912. They had their first public Christmas tree display. This is a whole other thread that we can go down, where Christmas trees, though they were catching on toward the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they didn't become especially common for a long time. It's not as though every family would have one in their living room. And part of that was because, you'd have to grow these as a commercial crop in order for that to be possible. Otherwise, you have to go into the woods and cut one down, and it's just not sustainable. So big Christmas tree, a Christmas tree in the public square was how a lot of people would experience a Christmas tree. And New York started doing those early in the 20th century. But also, it was the home to the first commercial Christmas tree lot. And that was in Washington Square, which was this enormous public square where, they'd have you can buy all of your meats and dry goods, just like an open air market. But during the Christmas season, that's where everyone would go to get all of their provisions for the season. It's even said that Clement Clarke Moore was on his way to Washington Square when he got the idea to write A Visit from St. Nicholas.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'm telling you, this is endless, just fascinating tidbits that you put in here. And that brings me to my next thing, which is gingerbread men, which you talk about. And I was wondering, just from a research perspective, did you find it difficult to not only research the history of gingerbread men as it pertains to Christmas, but you also had to research gingerbread men or gingerbread in general, and then the history of ginger? So what was your process for that?
Yeah, it's kind of a good example of what it's like to research any of these topics. And I feel like with foods in particular, there's this special quality about them where they start out their lives and live most of their lives having no special connection to Christmas at all. Like for a long time, gingerbread was the thing that you would go get at the fair, kind of like how, you get funnel cake at the fair now. And it was always, it typically had a religious connotation. So there'd be the fairs that I'm talking about would be fairs that recognized a saint. And the gingerbread would be served warm, and it wasn't like a cookie, more like a little pie or cake. And they would have these special stamps, wooden stamp that they would stamp into the gingerbread, and it would leave the impression of like an image of a saint. And then they would dust it with powdered sugar so it would pick up the impression. And for that reason, it was true that only certain people could create gingerbread. You'd actually have to get a license to do it because it was seen as sort of being part of a religious celebration. But the earliest gingerbread, this is one of the interesting things that I discovered, was earliest gingerbread had absolutely no connection to what you and I know as, these molassesy little cookies that look like men. It was really, the earliest word was something we'd pronounce more like gingerbras, which some people say it really translates to more just like preserved ginger. And this all had to do with, ginger being brought back from Asia, became a big part of the spice trade. It became really popular as more like a indigestion cure and as a food preservative. But then, as far as I can tell, in Nuremberg, this is where like all the bakers wanted to go because it was right in the middle of a big spice trading route. So that was where you wanted to be if you were a prestigious baker. They had access to all the good stuff. And that's where we start to see the gingerbread that we know start to take shape, one with, all the cloves and the nutmeg or whatever. And that would be sold during the St. Nicholas Day festivals and the Christmas markets. And that's where it starts to take on the shape of what we know today. Gingerbread men, as far as anyone can tell, were first created by Queen Elizabeth, who would create, and not, like the gingerbread men we know, like their arms sticking out. It would be, she would have an artist make a mold that was meant to resemble the people coming to visit her, these important people coming to visit where she lived. And they make these gingerbread men figures for them to eat. Where we actually, so how all of that gets to where we are today, where gingerbread is more or less just something that you have at Christmas. I mean, when else do you have it? It's so hard to say why that happens, but it's also true of eggnog, for example, fruitcake. I mean, fruitcake was, Queen Victoria served fruitcake at her wedding. It was just a thing that, it was a celebration food. Eggnog was a basic wintertime thing that you drank. If you wanted to, back in the days before pasteurization and refrigeration, if you wanted to drink milk in the winter, you put some alcohol in it. Like that was just how that went. And then, so you have these spiced drinks called possets or flips or whatever. But then somehow most likely the somehow was once they came over to America, where in a lot of ways we were starting fresh again, where we had this thing. We just basically decided that it belonged for Christmas only. But I think there are other examples of traditions that, no, actually, I'm going to stop there. I'll come back to that idea maybe later on.
Now, what about gingerbread houses? When did that become such a big deal? Because I know now when you go to the store, you'll see all sorts of themed gingerbread houses that you can make. And it seems to me something that's a little bit more recent.
So the Brothers Grimm, when they published their collection of German folktales, they did Hansel and Gretel, obviously. And right around that time, shortly afterward, bakers would put these special houses in their windows around Christmas time. They weren't called gingerbread house; they were called Hexenhausen, right? Meaning witch's house. And so many people would say, okay, well that you could still buy those in Germany. For example, they sell prepackaged one called Hexenhausen. And so a lot of people think that either the Brothers Grimm added that to the story, and that's what made it popular, or it was something that was around that they were aware of, and that's what they're referencing in their story. The problem is there's just not a lot of good record. Like no one can agree on when or how that happened, but we know that they became popular right around that time. Now, these prepackaged ones, I mean, those were like my lifetime. With I feel like in the last 10 or 15 years, you start to see these prepackaged gingerbread houses, and they're terrible. The gingerbread is really gross. My mom's always made one from scratch.
Wow.
Yeah, and so this year I tried to recreate one that she made, and she made it like with I don't know if I'm going off topic here, but
No.
she would make more, you cut out the windows, and then she would take hard candy and crush it up into a dust, and then you put that in the window while it baked. And so it basically became like candy glass. And if you put a light inside the gingerbread house, the light shines through. Like this, going back to, the kinds of Christmases I grew up with, it was stuff like that. And so I attempted to remake one of those this year for my baby boy. So
were you successful?
It'll never be as good as hers was, but I feel like it was okay.
Now that sounds like a real gingerbread house, one with sort of that stained glass and real gingerbread. Yeah, that's amazing. Now, a couple other things I want to touch on about that really surprised me. One of which, and I had to laugh because in your book, you kind of mentioned this right away. I totally envisioned sugar plums being plums with sugar on them.
Yep.
If you're in the chat and you also did that, don't make me feel like the only one that thought that. Can you explain what a sugar plum is and how that came to be in sort of the Christmas vernacular?
Yeah. So so you thought sugar plums were plums with sugar on them. Other people would say that they're probably like some candy made of sugar that looks like a plum. Or if you go around Googling, you'll see these recipes online where you take some kind of combination of dried fruits and nuts and sweetener, and you put it in a food processor until it turns into this kind of thick, sticky paste, roll it up into balls, and then dust it with sugar, and those are sugar plums. I've tried making those, and they're great, but they're not sugar plums. So a long, long time ago, as far as anyone can tell, the first use of the word had nothing to do with food. It was somebody had, in a pamphlet, used the word to describe a bribe for like hush money. And no one really knows why, like if it was referring to something or if it was just a made up word or something like that. But that's the first time we see the word coming into the English vocabulary. Shortly after that, you had confectioners who were making what we would now recognize as a comfit. I think the closest thing that we know that's still around today are those Jordan almonds, those almost like a thick candy shell. But it would be more like caraway seeds or cardamom pods that were covered with candy. And when I say candy, I mean like a sugar coating, but not something that you would consume as candy, because when they first came out, they were something that you would find in an apothecary. They were used for like hangover remedies or treatment for bad breath. Only later did they become like a candy. And part of the reason that that happened was that the price of sugar fell dramatically. Like sugar used to be really expensive, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. And so that it became more popular. And then somehow, some way, it just they just went away. I mean, you can find some version of it, like I mentioned, Jordan almonds, but caraway seeds covered in sugar, you can't really see them anymore. Although I should say, outside of some Indian restaurants, I don't know if you ever noticed this, they have this little bowl with a spoon in it where they have like caraway seeds and like those little,
Yes.
every other one has a candy coating. That's probably pretty close to what we thought of as sugar plums. Then the word sugar plums, and even just plums, kind of mutated to just mean anything good, anything sweet, or anything desirable. It's why we say if you have a cushy job, you have a plum position. Plum was just this general all-purpose word for meaning something was, just desirable. So yeah, so it's one of those words, kind of like humbug or whatever, that exists really just so that we can use it at Christmas. I mean, the only other time you would use sugar plum, the only time at all that you use the word sugar plum is when you're talking about Christmas, and specifically when you're reciting that one line from the poem. They're saying visions of sugar plums were dancing in the children's heads, but we have no idea what that vision might have looked like, because sugar plums, it could have meant comfits, it could have meant those caraway covered, those sugar covered caraway seeds, or it could have just meant like sweet dreams.
Yeah, I'll never think of anything else when I hear sugar plums now. And I'm glad that you taught me that. I love it. Now, getting a little bit away from the food that we've kind of talked about and the drinks, I want to switch gears a little bit to Santa Claus himself. And I found that section of your book just absolutely fascinating. And so there's so many legends and myths and history behind him. Can you talk about one or two of your favorites?
Well, there is an old legend. The thing is, with the historical Saint Nicholas, and when we often say Saint Nicholas and Santa Claus in the same breath, I mean, they're two very different things, although there is a continuity line between them. But the historical Saint Nicholas, we don't really know too much about him, other than he definitely existed. I mean, he's a saint in the Catholic Church. He probably attended the Council of Nicaea. That's when Constantine called this conference of bishops to kind of hammer out some theological points. And that he very likely was born to rich parents who died in the plague. And so when he entered, a religious life, he had a lot of money and didn't really have much to do with it. So he was very generous. And that's possibly where his reputation as a gift giver comes from. And so there's this one legend that there was this destitute family that he wanted to help. And so at night, he would secretly leave them money. And the way that he would do that is he would go up on their roof and drop money down their chimney. And the chimney, sometimes it was the coins would bounce up and land in the stockings that were hanging by the fire. And that's how we get all of this Santa Claus stuff. The problem with that story is that houses didn't have chimneys until about 800 years after St. Nicholas died. They were a Roman invention. And so that's not to say that he didn't help some destitute family, but he didn't do it like that. But then there's other stories where after St. Nicholas, again, St. Nicholas, not Santa Claus, after he died, he became the patron saint of seafarers. And it's still still common to this day to see a little statue of St. Nicholas on a ship for protection. He was the patron saint of pawnbrokers and brewers and travelers. And there's this one story about how these three travelers went to an inn, and the innkeeper was greedy and knew that they were traveling with money. So what he did was killed them and dismembered them. This is a very gruesome story, and put them in a salt tub that would be used for curing meat. And then sometime later, St. Nicholas came, found out what had gone on, and then resurrected the three boys and returned them to life and put them back together and all that. And the innkeeper repented, etc. That was another thing. Like during legends about Nicholas spread, where there was a lot of stuff that it sounds like stuff that you'd only hear in the Bible and only really being connected to one figure from the Bible. And he, raising the dead, multiplying stockpiles of grain, all kinds of stuff like that. There's lots and lots of stories about how he'd rescue condemned men just, moments before they're about to be executed and things like that. And then, of course, later it's like we move from that to this, fat guy who flies around in a sleigh with 8 reindeer.
Yeah, I just found that wonderful to read. Now, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I want to get a little bit more about it, is the difference between Merry Christmas and Happy Christmas. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah, so I guess the story begins shortly after, in England, when Oliver Cromwell and his puritanical government was in power. They banned Christmas. I won't go into that, but like, long story short, that all went away. The monarchy was restored. Christmas came back, but it kind of took a while for it to figure out what it was. It was gone for a while, and then it was, kind of coming back. You get up to Victorian times, and Christmas was sort of more like a public celebration, in the same way that the 4th of July or Mardi Gras or New Year's are. The community celebrated out in the streets and the pubs and the town square, not necessarily in the home. Nowadays, Christmas is both, of course, right? We have the big public things and the home-based celebrations. But it had taken on a reputation as being, maybe something a little bit more, for the common people. And there's even this tradition known as Callithumpian music. And Callithumpian is a Greek word meaning beautiful, but what it was actually referring to was people basically just making an ungodly racket in the streets after having a few too many eggnogs. And the Victorian upper classes were just not super happy with this. They wanted to rebrand Christmas. And whenever you say the Victorians rebranded Christmas, it almost sounds like, this council of Victorians was at Victorian headquarters, and they're like, okay, from this day forward, it was a gradual process, right? But there were a lot of social influences and a lot of technological influences, because this period is also when rail travel became really common and popular. And that also had a really dramatic influence on what Christmas could be, where all of a sudden it could be a time for homecomings. And that really helped to kind of push Christmas into more of this like homey, family-based celebration rather than a community-based one. So anyway, Merry Christmas was the way that you would wish someone the greetings of the season prior to this transformation to being more of a home-based one. And Happy Christmas was what the upper classes wanted to start saying as a way of, kind of highbrowing Christmas a little bit. And it was, I've talked about this a bunch of times before already, the influence of the media. It was in one of King George's addresses where he used specifically the phrase Happy Christmas in a radio address, to really say, and of course he was pre-Victorian, but to start to move things toward Happy Christmas. I had always thought that, like, in England they say Happy Christmas, in America they say Merry Christmas. I know a lot of people from England, they said, nah, it's like 50-50 here. We say Merry Christmas too. And I think over here it's different. I think if you say Happy Christmas, you're kind of putting on airs, or like you're trying to sound British, but I think over in England they're pretty happy to say it both ways. But yeah, it was really, saying Merry Christmas was something that would mark you as a drunken reveler for a little while.
Who knew? Who would ever think that? I think it's funny too, because I think the Happy Christmas gets reinforced. I know for me, I remember thinking, oh, I saw that in Harry Potter. I remember them saying Happy Christmas. So I always thought that was kind of the British way of saying it. So now that you mention that, it's kind of a mixed bag between happy and merry over there. Yeah. It makes more sense. Now, I wanted to bring this up specifically. You mentioned that children used to receive letters from Santa more so than children sending letters to Santa, which is the case today. Yep. And I bring this up specifically because obviously this is the Mark Twain house, Samuel Clemens. He had 3 little girls that he raised, and we have a letter that we love to read during our holiday tours where Santa writes to Susie, and he's referred to as the man in the moon. And he kind of gives her instructions about a present that he still needed to deliver to her. And so when I was reading your book, that clicked in my brain of, oh, wow, there is Santa writing a letter to one of the Clemens children. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, because I never realized that it used to be the opposite of what we think of today.
Yeah, and you have to remember, writing letters to Santa really wouldn't be something that's common or even possible until we had postal reform in America. Like, for a long, long time, if you got mail, you went to the post office. You would drop your mail off. You would pick up any mail that was left there for you. Once home delivery of mail, or mail just, the mailman just came to your house and all that could just happen without you leaving your house. That's when you start to see this correspondence between kids and Santa Claus starting. But you're right that it was first more like parents writing to their children in the voice of Santa Claus saying, have you been a good little boy, good little girl this year? The problem is once that happened, kids started to get the idea like, all right, well, if this guy can write to me, I can write back to him. And so this was, I want to say, like late 19th, early 20th century. And this is a whole other story where kids would write letters to Santa. But, there was no one address. Even the notion that he lives at the North Pole was still not totally solidified yet. But it caused a big problem for the post office because once a mail carrier picks up your letter, like it is in the postal system and there's a protocol. You have to try to deliver it somewhere. And then otherwise it has to go to the dead letter office. And there's this whole thing. And this was causing a big PR headache for some postmasters where they weren't prepared for what to do in a situation like this. So they had to improvise. And what some of them would do would just release the letters to a local newspaper who would print the letters. And because a lot of the letters, I remember having the letters I wrote to Santa were, nice and cozy, I want a Tonka truck or whatever. But a lot of the letters that they were getting were just like, I need food, or my sister needs, crutches. I mean, just really heartbreaking stuff. So what some places would do would put it in the newspaper so that if anyone wanted to play Santa Claus, they could answer the kid's letter. But even so, it was still kind of against the postal regulations. And then some charity commissioners were saying, guys, you got to put, you can't do that anymore. So they had to shut it down. And so then a lot of newspapers were running stories being like, oh, look at the Postal Service. They're denying all these kids getting their letters to Santa Claus answered. And there's this whole other story that I've done on the podcast as a mini series because it's such a big story about this man named John Gluck who came along and said, I can solve this problem. I can create a clearinghouse to match letters to Santa with all of these people in my Rolodex because I work in customs and I know all these really rich people. And he used this whole thing to create not a charity. And this is how he was able to do it for so long because he wasn't raising money. He wasn't subjected to any scrutiny from regulatory bodies. But he created this massive organization that he kind of used to enrich himself because first he started to say, oh, well, maybe you guys can donate some money to cover the cost of postage. And then the next thing you know, he's just raising all this money and no one really knew where the money was going. That's a bit of an aside, I know, but if anyone's interested, just look up John Gluck, the Santa Claus Association. Really, really fascinating story. But yeah, so it was parents writing to kids as Santa Claus first, and then they started writing back.
Wow. Well, I was an odd child. I simply wrote to the Tooth Fairy asking for more money. So I didn't write to Santa like most children. So I'm going to ask you one last question before we go into what I call the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you some Christmas preferences that you have. But my last question, and for those of you watching, now is the time, if you've thought of a question, to put it in the Q&A because we're going to be doing that next. So you did talk about Christmas traditions and how some of them have endured over time, like the use of the electric lights from the 1880s, and then also how some have faded, like the aluminum tree you mentioned. What is a tradition that's kind of fallen to the wayside over the years that you would like to see make a comeback?
Let's see. Well, there's one, roasting chestnuts. I love chestnuts, and I feel like most people that I know have never even tried them. You can get them. So, in the Northeast, you'll still see them, but they used to be a huge thing. And it's not like they fell to the wayside. It was the Japanese chestnut trees that were imported to America had a fungal blight that wiped out all the chestnuts. And so it was literally 3 years after the Christmas song came out where they're singing chestnuts roasting on an open fire, the opening line being like that emblematic image of Christmas where all the chestnut trees were dead. There are I'm trying to think of some of the older ones, or it's not even older ones that have fallen out of favor, but ones that I know from other countries that I would like to see us adopt. I know in Iceland, they have a big thing about giving books on Christmas Eve, which I think is really just kind of a nice, cozy thing. Yeah, I'd say those two.
Okay, those are good answers. All right, so now we're going to jump into our lightning round. So do you have a favorite ornament? And if so, what is it?
Yes. Oh, I'm going to show it to you guys right now.
Perfect.
I don't even hang it on the tree anymore. I keep it framed.
Wow.
So this is my hand in 1977 that my mom traced out of that dough. You know that dough that you make with flour and salt and water. It's almost like Play-Doh.
Yep.
But then she baked it and varnished it. And when I moved out of the house, a long time ago, I'm one of 5 kids, and we each took some of our Christmas stuff. I have all the vinyl records and a couple decorations in my stocking. And I thought I took the hand with me. And then a few years later, I'm decorating for Christmas, and I can't find the hand. And I thought I had lost it. And for a long time, like every Christmas, I would be really sad about it. And I never talked to my mom about it, but I thought I had lost the hand. And then when was this? 3 or 4 years ago, I got a package in the mail, and my mom she had it all along and sent it back to me. And so I was like, okay, never again am I going to lose this hand, because this is, like one of the prized possessions. I mean, literally, it's one of the favorite things in my life that I own. It's like a big picture of my hand from when I was 3 years old. So I'm going to mount it and frame it. So I don't even know if it counts as an ornament anymore. It's more like
I think that counts.
It's in my wall.
I love it. Favorite Christmas food and drink?
I'm going to say something controversial, but I love fruitcake, and I don't care who knows it. And if you don't like fruitcake, I'm guessing it's because you've never had a good one. And that's true for most people, because the mass-produced stuff that you get is horrible, and it's too labor-intensive to try to make yourself. It's the same thing with a figgy pudding. Like, I make one every year, and it's a process. If you want to do it right, you make it a couple months in advance, and you feed it, which means like you brush brandy on it every 2 weeks or whatever, to age it and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot that goes into it. But you can get good pre-made ones. Gethsemane Farms, which is this monastery in Kentucky, makes a really good one every year. The Vermont Country Store, believe it or not, has a pretty good fruitcake. But nothing tastes as Christmassy as fruitcake to me.
Okay, I'm gonna have to give fruitcake another try. Favorite Christmas commercial?
Oh, wow, that's a great one. I just remember all those Toys R Us ones from when I was growing up. The cartoon ones with Jeffrey, and had that little song, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid." I remember that. And here's the other thing, like I said about the 70s and 80s having all that nostalgia. You can go down those YouTube rabbit holes of like nostalgic Christmas TV commercials from the 70s and 80s. I always remember that one of Ronald McDonald ice skating with I don't know if you're familiar with what I'm talking about. It's like Ronald McDonald is ice skating, and this one little kid is like too small to skate with the big kids, and then Ronald McDonald skates with him, and it's a happy ending, and then the McDonald's logo comes up. Yeah.
Mine is the M&M Coming Upon Santa. I like that one.
Yeah, that's a very 90s one. Yeah.
Yeah. Favorite Christmas gift as a child?
It was this magic set that I really, really wanted. And I talk about this in the book, as a matter of fact. Back in those days, you used to get these huge catalogs, like glossy paper catalogs. And they come around the early fall, and like I would get lured in with all this catalog copy about Star Wars play sets and everything. But there was this one magic set, and it was like, the Chinese illusions of magic, and it was all this like secrets of the mystics revealed for the first time. And of course, it's just like a kid's magic, like linking rings and sponge balls or whatever. But for me, this was just, oh my goodness, I have to have this. And I thought I was going to get it one Christmas, and I'd opened up all my other Christmas presents. There was one left. It was roughly the size and shape of this thing. Tore open the paper, and it wasn't. It was something completely, I don't even remember what it was. I just remember it not being the thing that I wanted. But then the following Christmas, I got it. My mom, had the camera ready, like just to capture the moment of complete disbelief and shock. And I think I had that thing like for years. I don't think I used it for you, but it was up in the attic. I remember when I moved out of the house, it was still up there. That thing was like a prized possession for me.
Oh, that's great. All right, last couple. Favorite animated Christmas TV special?
Probably Frosty. And it's not that it always was. It was, my son is 2 years old now, and we're starting to introduce screen time. So he can watch one show a week. And, we're watching animated ones. And we watched Rudolph last week. And I hadn't watched Rudolph for a long time. And watching it as an adult and watching a kid watch it, my wife and I were looking at each other like, this thing's like not all that good. If you're looking at it like coming in kind of fresh, like this is not that good at all. But Frosty just seemed, I don't know, it seemed kind of cute. My son loved it, so that's my new favorite.
Oh, I love it. I'm particular to the Heat Miser Snow
Yeah,
Miser. I love that one. That's a good one. All right. Last one, favorite Christmas song.
Well, I'd say for new ones, it would probably be Kelly Clarkson's Underneath the Tree. For old ones, I gotta say White Christmas. Oh no, you know what? I'm gonna say Cradle in Bethlehem, the Nat King Cole version.
Yes.
It's on his Christmas album, but it's like one of the last songs. It's kind of buried and it doesn't get a lot of attention. And typically I don't go for the religious themed Christmas songs, because most of the ones that came out of the 40s were more secular, like White Christmas and I'll Be Home for Christmas. But for me, that song combines basically everything about that 40s Christmas song sound. Like everything that makes those songs sound like what they are is in that song. And just like, so all the orchestration, all like the oohs and the ahs in the background and everything, all the little jazzy chord movements, it's all there. And then Nat King Cole's voice is just like gorgeous. So yeah, I think so.
All right. Well, thank you for that. While Omar is coming back to answer your questions, I just want to end with a quote from your book where you say, Christmas is many things. It can be magical, stressful, sentimental, crassly commercial, overbearing, joyous, nostalgic, repetitive, and strange. And all of that makes Christmas endlessly fascinating. So I thought that's a perfect way to wrap up. I highly encourage you all to go to the link in the chat and get a purchase of Brian's book. It is fascinating. It not only talks about your favorite Christmas traditions, but the history behind them, a lot of things I never knew, and it's just very entertaining. Make a great gift, or if you just love Christmas, buy it for yourself. So with that, I will turn it over to Omar to ask some audience questions.
Thanks, Mallory. All right. We have some questions here. The first one is, this is actually a really interesting question. They're asking about insights about Krampus, and I just want to add my own observation that Krampus has only become like known in America. It seems like in the last maybe 10 years or something. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about Krampus.
The only thing I can tell you is that it's not Krampus, it's Krampus. And I got that from Emily Zarka, who is an actual, like a monsterologist. She's this PhD person. She has a series on PBS called Monstrum, and she did an episode about Krampus. We did a very brief interview this year where we talked about that. I have not done a full exploration of that where I look into it. Personally, it's kind of not my thing. I know a lot of people love the kind of gross, weird, scary, spooky side of Christmas. I just tend to shy away from that. I can tell you it's an Austrian tradition where, you know, Krampus is kind of this goat demon looking figure. But I'm not going to babble on because I just don't know too much about him.
Someone is also asking any news about mistletoe. Maybe they just mean they want some more information about mistletoe.
Yeah, mistletoe is an interesting one because when in places where trees kind of die down for the winter, right? There would be the ones that didn't. Holly, ivy, the conifers, they stayed green amidst the winter landscape. And so people thought, okay, well, there's got to be something special about these. And all kinds of stories popped up about they have medicinal properties, they're good for fertility, they're, you know, this, that, whatever. And mistletoe kind of fell into that camp, but it also had a special extra quality to it because it didn't grow in the ground. It grew off of other trees. And at that, it grew very high up in those trees. And so people said, okay, well, there must be something super duper special about this stuff. What they didn't realize is that the reason it's growing high up in trees is because birds would eat their seeds. And then as birds were flying up in the trees and, you know, did their droppings, the seeds would pass undigested through their system. The droppings would basically adhere to the side of the tree, and that mistletoe, being a parasitic plant, would just grow out of the side of the tree like that. And so that's why you see, but they had all kinds of stories like, oh, maybe the gods are throwing it down. It's like, well, someone's throwing it down, but it ain't the gods. And that's not how it's happening. But like all of those other plants, there were, you know, different ideas about whether they have medicinal properties, whether they'd be good for fertility, etc. Mistletoe is actually still used medicinally in some cases, as far as I know. But yeah, it took on a special connection with fertility, and that's why kissing underneath it became a thing. And that wasn't necessarily a Christmas thing. That's another theme I come against again and again. It's like a lot of these traditions predate Christmas. They just kind of get rolled into Christmas.
Someone's wondering why the three kings or the three wise men haven't become important in the US. They say in the very long Christmas season in Puerto Rico, which I know about because that's where my family is from, the three kings are at the center of many of the decorations. So why haven't the three kings become important in Christmas traditions in the US?
I'm afraid I can't answer that. I don't know.
Someone's also wondering where elves originate. Today, elf on a shelf is a surprisingly popular trend.
Yeah. So elves, those are mostly from late 19th century artwork. I want to say it was Thomas Nast was either, if not the first, the most popular artist who showed Santa Claus as living at the North Pole and is having a team of elves working for him. This is also just a really interesting chapter in the history of Santa Claus, where this was right around the time when, A Visit from St. Nicholas was published. That was 1823. And in the poem, he's an elf. He's not a person. He's an elf. He rides a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer. He has a little round belly. And in a lot of the artwork that you see around that time, he's, looks about 3 feet tall. He might even have pointy ears or a bulbous nose. He might look like a little gnome. It really isn't until you get into, I'd say, the 1920s, where you have artists like Norman Rockwell, J.C. Leondecker doing their covers for the Saturday Evening Post, and then later Haddon Sundblom, who did work for the Coca-Cola Company, where our image of Santa really solidifies. But getting back to the original question, it was around the late 19th century that we start to see Santa lives at the North Pole. He works with elves. He himself is an elf. And that even as he evolves into becoming more just like a person, the elves stay elves.
Someone's asked a very Clemens related question. So it would be for Mallory, but I'm also going to personally extend it a little bit. So the question is, what are some of the Victorian Christmas traditions celebrated in the Clemens family home? And you can find out about those in various events that we have, by the way. So that's for Mallory, and I'll extend the question a little bit for Brian. Were there any traditions in the, or were there any changing of traditions, new traditions added, or old traditions, moved away from at the turn of the 20th century? That were really, really important, that were really important. So Mallory, if you want to answer the Clemens specific part of that.
I'll share a few because I highly encourage everyone to either come take a Christmas tour of the Mark Twain House if you can make it, or as Omar said, we have lots of programs talking about that. But they had a lot of their traditions revolved around things like making ornaments for the tree. So we know that they strung popcorn and cranberries, that they made cornucopias, and they'd make these out of paper and then fill them with nuts and hang them off the tree. And this was before store-made ornaments became popular. So they were making a lot of that. They also, of course, were very excited during Christmas time to help with the decorations, which were very much nature inspired. So a lot of greenery, pine cones, berries throughout the house. Christmas cards, which I know Brian talks about in his book, started to become popular during this time. So you'd see Christmas cards starting to decorate the Clemens family mantle. And then one of the wonderful things that they did was that their mother, Olivia, would make baskets for the less fortunate in the community. And so the Clemens girls would help her put those baskets together, and then they would ride with the coachman, Patrick McAleer, and deliver those baskets to the less fortunate. So it was sort of a mixture of typical traditions that are still happening today with making ornaments and decorating, and then also that philanthropic side of giving back. And she was really intent on making sure her children learned that. So those are some of them, but I highly recommend, as Omar said, checking out a program or coming and taking a holiday tour of the house. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Brian.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question to me was.
Sorry, the question was, what traditions were starting to be observed for Christmas at the turn of the 20th century that were different from before that?
Like new traditions created in the 20th century?
At the turn of the 20th century.
In America, do you mean?
Yeah, yes.
Not quite sure I have a great answer for you there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So that's I think those are all the questions that we have. So thanks so much to Brian and Mallory, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll have, as we just said, we'll have plenty of holiday programs in the next couple of weeks. We'll have virtual Clemens conversations. We have ones on the Christmases abroad and apart and decking the halls and trimming the tree. There will also be in-person Christmas editions of our Get a Clue tours. And finally, we'll have an author program on the Magi next Tuesday, the 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And that should be another very interesting look at a part of Christmas. You can find all the links for all of these on our website and on social media. We'll also be posting the recording for this program tomorrow morning, so you can share it, watch it again, or share it with your friends and family. And that is all. So I wish you a good evening. Thanks again. And thank you so much for joining us. And please buy Brian's book.
Yes, you will enjoy it. Definitely go buy it. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.